Hello everyone, and welcome to the Hearth. It's Halloween, that time of year where everyone loves the scarier things. Everyone wants a good ghost story or a good zombie apocalypse, something just the right amount of unsettling for them to enjoy. I'm quite a fan of the scarier stories myself, so I thought, why don't I pull one off the shelf for you? Needless to say, this also goes as a disclaimer. The story is meant to be a little scary, so if that's not quite your cup of tea, I suggest you check out some of the other stories, or perhaps wait until next time. If, however, this is something you're interested in, if you're feeling the Halloween vibe, then enjoy and have a happy Halloween. Grand Mills was a town that was neither grand nor in possession of mills of any kind. Joseph had spent his whole life in Grand Mills, and while it wasn't exactly boring, there was only so much one could do. Everything gets boring eventually, and Joseph had finally grown bored of this town. He had fished until he could practically reach in the lake and grab the fish with his hands, and he could navigate the forest around it with his eyes closed. He knew every twist, every sometimes on some imaginary adventure, other times, as he got older, simply wandering to kill time. If you asked Joseph, he could tell you the location and purpose of every building in town without fail. Yet, he could tell you nothing about what lay outside the bounds of Grand Mills. Whether it was the heat of summer or the cold of winter, the town of Grand Mills was encompassed at all times by an impenetrable fog, a gray haze that never thinned or lifted. The town had two rules: don't make trouble for your neighbors, and never venture into the fog. Everyone obeyed. No one had set foot in the fog as long as Joseph had ever lived. He had asked his parents, his teachers, and his relatives, but none of them seemed to know what made the fog so dangerous. No one went near it. They all regarded the fog as some perilous force. Yet none of them actually seemed to know why they should be so wary. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, fear of the fog was something of a household commodity. Joseph couldn't count the number of times his parents had threatened to give him to the fog if he didn't behave. As a child, he too had been afraid of the eternal swath of gray that isolated his home. But as he grew into adolescence, that fear turned into curiosity. He wanted, more than anything, to see what was beyond the fog. What lay outside of Grand Mills? So, tonight, he was going to find out. He couldn't convince any of his friends to come with him. None of them would even dream of going into the fog. Once he hatched his plans to them, it had taken nearly an hour of persuading just to get them not to tell his parents. He couldn't have his plan fail before it even started. Thus, there he was, creeping through the kitchen just before midnight, armed with a flashlight and his school backpack, his books having been replaced with snacks and an extra flashlight, which he had taken from the basement that afternoon. He silently pulled on his shoes and slipped out the front door. the slightest squeak of the hinges grating on his ears. Thankfully, there seemed to be no response from his parents' room. He slipped away into the night, trying to keep himself calm. No one was around. Chances were, no one was even awake. Yet he felt like every house was watching him, waiting for the right moment to turn their lights on and pounce on him, declaring his guilt. He expected his neighbors to burst from their front doors at any second, shouting for all the world to hear that he was sneaking away. Yet, no lights sprung to life, and no doors opened. Soon he was out past the lake, farther than he had ever been, and he could see the wall of fog ahead of him. He felt his excitement brimming over. He had never even been this close to the fog before. It was exhilarating just to see it so closely, watching it gently swirl and twist around itself. It didn't seem scary or ominous at all. Joseph couldn't understand why anyone was so wary of it. He reached out tentatively, brushing his fingers through the fog. He felt nothing. He didn't know what he expected. It was just fog after all. Joseph took a step back, staring up at it. This wall was made of nothing but water vapor. It wasn't even solid matter. Yet it had kept him and everyone else in Grand Mills trapped their entire lives. He smiled as his anticipation grew even more. It wasn't going to hold him back any longer. With that, he leapt into the fog. He passed effortlessly through, landing rather ordinarily. Again, he wasn't sure why he expected the fog to be so difficult to penetrate. He continued on, more than a little glad there was no one around to witness his more embarrassing moments. He hadn't gone too far when he discovered a sign. It was a simple, friendly sign that read, "Welcome to Grand Mills," in swirly letters. This small discovery filled him with wonder. He had found something in the fog. His curiosity magnified. He hadn't known Grand Mills had a sign. He couldn't wait to see what else the fog held. His flashlight certainly came in handy. He wouldn't have been able to navigate the fog at all without it. While he didn't find much excitement at first, it was exhilarating enough to spot the trees along the road, or glimpse the shadow of an animal scurry away from his flashlight beam. Eventually, he did come across something of note. Several abandoned cars parked along the side of the road. There were no signs of passengers or drivers of any kind, and the vehicles sported rust patches all over. They had been left here for a long time. Joseph shined his light through the windows, looking for something interesting inside. His search rewarded him with a few empty water bottles, but nothing else. He continued on, making sure to stick to the road. The longer he walked, the more abandoned cars he found. Was he in some kind of junkyard? Grand Mills had a small junkyard, but there was no way it could hold this many cars. They even clogged the road, forcing Joseph to clamber over and around them. Where did all these cars come from? Why were they all here? He crossed a large 4-lane bridge, something he had never seen in person before. He was constantly sweeping his flashlight over the structure, shocked by even the little that he could see. If anything, his light's failure to reveal the whole of the structure made it more awe-inspiring. It was a great metal giant, dramatically hidden in the fog. He almost didn't want to leave, but what was the point of exploring if he stopped now? He pressed on, keeping his flashlight at his feet. There seemed to be nothing around him now. He saw no more abandoned cars, no trees or animals. Simply the road ahead of him. The fog was thick enough to obscure whatever his flashlight didn't reach. He felt uneasy, like the fog was trapping him, like he was suddenly alone in the world. He paused, digging the second flashlight out of his bag, wielding them both to light his way. With the combined brightness of both lights, it wasn't long before he began to spot things in the distance. Despite the fog, he saw the silhouettes of trees and a few bushes. Nothing particularly interesting appeared, but it was still comforting to see his surroundings. He was just about to call it a night when his flashlight caught the edge of some kind of wooden structure. As he approached, he realized it was the Grand Mill sign he had seen when he first set out. He paused, a little surprised. Was this whole road a circle? Perhaps he had taken a turn on accident? After all, he couldn't see much. Either way, Joseph decided this was as good a time as any to call it quits. He couldn't risk staying out all night. Besides, if this road was just a circle, he could always go back out tomorrow night. Soon he was through the threshold and once again within the bounds of the city. All in all, a fun adventure, although it was a bit of a letdown. He had been hoping for something a little more dramatic. He snuck back through the town, doing his best to stay out of sight. He was in the home stretch now. He was even more nervous than when he snuck out of the town. Any moment he expected to see his parents, perhaps the police, round the corner and catch him, ready to ground him for the rest of his life. His flashlights were off now. He was relying on his memory and what little he could see to get him home. In the end, it was his memory that first made him aware that something was wrong. It wasn't anything definite at first, just a sudden thought that something wasn't quite right. He paused, standing at the mouth of the alley between the pharmacy and the convenience store. Something about it was wrong, a sensation of grating certainty that wouldn't go away until he figured out what wasn't supposed to be there. Suddenly, it occurred to him. There wasn't supposed to be an alley here. The space should be occupied by dumpsters. There had never been any space to walk here. Yet now it was open. Had they moved the dumpsters? He couldn't remember if he had seen them on his way to the fog. It wasn't exactly a major detail at the time. He peered into the alley, attempting to see the extent of the change. It was too dark to see without a light. None of the street lamps reached here. After a brief conflict, his curiosity overcame his nerves, and he pulled one of the flashlights back out of his backpack, the bulb flashing to life. The alley showed no signs of ever having housed anything, much less dumpsters. The ground was paved, just like the parking lots on either side of it. At the far end was a second difference, one he was sure hadn't been there before. The two buildings were joined by a third, smaller building about the size of an outhouse. There was a door built into the brick, and a broken, muddy track leading from the door toward the mouth of the alley. Joseph looked both ways, assuring he was alone before he entered the alley. The door looked old. Rust crept along the edges and threatened to encroach onto the door proper. He tugged on the handle, and the door yanked open, scraping loudly. He froze, but no one came to investigate. He took a deep breath and turned back to the door, shining his light through the doorway. A long stairway descended into the earth. This was getting stranger and stranger. The dumpsters he might have been able to chalk up to simply misremembering. It was possible they moved them and he didn't notice. But this building and this stairway had never been here. He was sure of that. He looked back one more time. He could go home. He could simply shut this door and forget about it. It was more than likely nothing. But that grating sense of unfamiliarity wouldn't leave him alone. This building was new. More than that, it had seemingly been constructed in the middle of the night, between when he left and when he returned. Yet there was rust on the door. He had to get to the bottom of this, or the mere fact of not knowing would plague him. Joseph began his descent, keeping his flashlight on the stairs ahead of him. It was a surprisingly short staircase, and in a matter of moments, he was in a cramped hallway. It occurred to him that he was beneath Grand Mills now. The pipelines along the walls probably ran to the pharmacy and the store. He continued down the hallway, which seemed to lead further beneath the town. He had no idea how long he navigated the corridor, but it didn't seem to end. There were no turns, no forks or intersections. It was simply one hallway, going deeper and deeper. What could this be for? Why would they need something like this? He became even more confused the longer it went on. He began to question if he had simply missed this, and it had been in that alley all along. His mind buzzed with questions, and his flashlight roamed the walls, looking for some kind of clue. His wish was soon granted. A faint orange glow came into view ahead of him. He pressed on, turning off his flashlight. He could hear a humming growing louder as he got closer. The glow flickered back and forth like a flame. He crept closer and closer. He was excited. He was about to see what this strange place held. The corridor widened into a large room, the walls bathed in orange light. A large machine covered one wall, flames writhing from behind several glass panes. The flames illuminated two people dragging a body from atop a pile in a wheelbarrow. Joseph crouched against the wall, doing his best to stay as small as possible. His mind was already racing, connecting dots. That was an incinerator. They were going to burn those people. This was a town where everyone knew everyone. He couldn't imagine anyone wanting to hurt anyone, much less kill and burn them. Were they even dead? The body hit the ground with a wet thud as they pulled it free from the wheelbarrow, and the spatter of blood answered his question. That person was most certainly dead. Those people had killed them. His heart began to rival his mind. He felt like both were going to launch out of his body. Someone, no, several people had been killed. Here? In Grand Mills? Why? What had happened while he had been gone? He had only been gone a few hours at most. Wouldn't the whole town know if so many people died like this? As the murderers dragged the body forward, one pulled the incinerator door open, shuffling back as a wave of heat washed out. The flame's light washed over the room, illuminating the body. The left side was mangled, as if someone had hacked away at it with a knife or axe. But the face was intact enough for him to recognize it. Believing it, however, was a different matter altogether. Joseph stared at his own bloodied, lifeless face, watching it sway as they heaved it into the flames. The two pushed the door shut, the room dimming again. Joseph simply stared. He hadn't even had time to process it before they threw him into the fire. Part of him believed he hadn't seen it. It was some kind of trick played by the flickering light or the ambience or something. But he couldn't explain it away. He couldn't explain it at all. The two in hazmat suits walked further down the corridor, opening another door at the far end. As it shut behind them, Joseph found his legs creeping forward, bringing him toward the wheelbarrow. He was squatting next to it now. All he had to do was stand up and he could see into it. He didn't know if he wanted to see who was in there, but he stood up anyway. There were 5 bodies draped more or less on top of each other. One was Mr. Miller, his biology teacher. 2 of them were unrecognizable, their heads mostly missing. 2 of the bodies were his own, sprawled in varying degrees of mutilated lifelessness at the top of the pile. Joseph stumbled back from the wheelbarrow, trying to catch his breath. What was going on? He didn't even know where his questions started. How were there more than one of him? Why had someone killed Mr. Miller? What was the reason for any of this? Had he really gone his whole life and never noticed this? The door swung open again, and the killers walked back in, each holding a steaming paper cup in one hand and their headgear in the other. Joseph once again locked eyes with himself, although these were much more alive. There was a scar above his brow, but aside from that, they looked exactly the same. Behind this other Joseph stood his father, an identical scar above his brow. He looked from one to the other, but his mind just couldn't catch up. He was in the incinerator, he was in the wheelbarrow, and he was the one throwing them all into the flames. How? How was any of this happening? In the end, it all culminated in a single question he finally managed to voice. Dad, what's going on? I'm not your father, Vale Walker. What are you talking about? Dad, how did you get that scar? You didn't have a scar. Why are there so many dead copies of me? Who is that? His father rubbed his scar with a finger. That is my real son. The scar is so we can tell. Don't worry about the rest. It won't matter soon enough. The scarred Joseph sprinted at him, and he threw the wheelbarrow to the ground, dumping bodies in his path. Joseph sprinted back through the hallway, grateful that it was a straight line. He could hear them chasing after him, shouting. The corridor that seemed to go on forever on the way down flashed by, and before he knew it, he was leaping up the stairs and through the old door, back out into the alley. He sprinted away, the scarred counterparts on his heels. They had to be counterparts, some kind of clones or something. They were shouting, and lights were switching on. People were leaning out of their windows and opening their doors. He ducked as something whizzed by his head. There was jeering and thudding as more people threw things at him. This made no sense. These were the people he had grown up with. Why were they doing this? His worries were shaken from his head as he was blindsided, slamming to the ground. Mr. Harold's, the owner of a pharmacy not too far from Joseph's house, grinned manically over him, holding a hammer, sporting the same identical scar over his brow. As the hammer came down, it clicked in Joseph's mind. This wasn't his home. He didn't know how, but this wasn't his Grand Mills. He twisted away from the strike, slapping his open palm over Mr. Harold's ear. The man fell back, clutching his head, and Joseph scrambled to his feet. He grabbed the hammer, catching his counterpart square in the chest with it as he closed in. He threw it into the growing mob chasing after him before sprinting away again. He had to get out of here. If there was any resemblance to his Grand Mills, they wouldn't follow him into the fog. He had to get to the fog. By the time he reached the lake, his lungs felt like they would deflate. He had never sprinted so far in his life. But looking back, he could see it was working. A large portion of the mob had dropped off, leaving only the more athletic ones. He forced his legs to keep going, trying to ignore the burning sensation in his knees and ankles. He was close. He could see the fog, but he was going to burn out soon. If he was wrong, he was as good as caught. His tired legs kept running. His tired lungs kept breathing, and he got closer and closer to the fog. He was only a few feet away when someone grabbed his backpack, pulling him backwards. He struggled, then gave up on the backpack, slipping out of the straps and running back to the fog. He didn't look back. He just ran. He was terrified. He passed through the fog, expecting to feel hands on his back and shoulders, dragging him back in, pulling him back towards that incinerator beneath the ground. But there was nothing, and he kept running until he passed the sign, at which point he collapsed to the ground, gasping. He lay on the ground for a good while, staring at the sign. Welcome to Grand Mills. He hadn't felt very welcome. Eventually, he pulled himself to his feet. The only thing he had with him now was his flashlight. He had honestly forgotten he was holding it. He clicked it on and slowly began his slog back home. At least, what he hoped was home. Finding the bridge a second time seemed to take longer than he felt it should. He didn't remember it being that far from the warped version of Grand Mills, but it was hard to tell any kind of time or distance in the fog. He made his way across the bridge, still listening for any sounds of pursuit. It didn't seem like they were coming after him, but he wasn't going to take any chances. Soon, the bridge gave way to the empty fog and open road at his feet. He followed it, doing his best to walk in a straight line. The trees no longer enchanted him. The fog no longer held any wonder or excitement. He just wanted to go home. Eventually, his flashlight caught the wooden legs of the Grand Mills sign, and he felt his heart leap. He scanned the sign with his flashlight. He was home. He walked by the sign, then stopped, backing up. He shined the light at it again. Had that paint been flaking before? Were those scratches in the wood there when he left? Joseph stared at the sign. He was overthinking it. He was home. He had to be. Or did he? He didn't really know he went the right way. He hardly knew what way he went to get to the other Grand Mills. He had just walked in what he thought was a straight line. He didn't really know if he took any turns or forks in the road. Besides, getting it wrong could very well kill him. There was nothing to prove there were only 2 Grand Mills, right? He sat down next to the sign. He didn't know. He just didn't know if this was the right one. He just didn't know. Joseph clicked off the flashlight, letting the fog envelop him. What did he do now? Marie landed inside the fog, stumbling a bit. She didn't know why, but she had jumped, almost expecting some kind of resistance. She clicked on her flashlight, sweeping it in a circle. She had done it. She was outside Grand Mills. Eric stumbled next to her. He looked around for a moment, his flashlight already on. To be honest, I kind of expected the fog to end, he mumbled. End? Marie questioned. What do you mean, end? Eric shrugged. Well, you know, I figured it would be maybe 10 feet of fog, and then it would end. It looks like it goes on forever. Maybe it does. Eric did another sweep with his flashlight. I don't know if I like that idea. Relax, we won't go far, come on. Marie grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. The two shone their lights every which way, looking for something interesting. It was like a whole new world. There was no telling what they would find. They hadn't gone far when Eric's flashlight caught the edge of something hidden in the fog. He jerked his arm. I found something. Follow me. He led her towards his mysterious find, which turned out to be a wooden sign, the paint peeling from age. The face read, Welcome to Grand Mills, in swirly, fancy letters. Not the most exciting discovery, but it was still new, and that alone was enough to attract their attention. I didn't know we had a sign, Marie said, stooping to examine it. Why isn't this inside the town? Eric shone his flashlight around the sign. There didn't appear to be any signs that had been moved. It seemed like it had always been there. Why would they make a sign only to stick it in the place no one is supposed to go? It's still cool, Marie replied. She squat-walked around the back of the sign, but before she could even begin to investigate it, something emerged from the fog, gripping her wrist. She screamed and pulled her arm away, scrambling backward. A feral-looking man crawled forward into the light, rising to his feet. His clothes were torn and didn't quite fit. His hair and beard clearly hadn't been cut or managed in any way for a long time, and his skin was stained by dirt and grass. His nails were jagged and broken off at strange angles, as if in some primitive way to regulate them. He staggered forward, and Eric rushed around to pull Marie to her feet. Stay back! He shouted, leveling his flashlight at the man. The stranger squinted, shielding his eyes for a moment, then reached out, grabbing the flashlight away. Go back, the man growled, and the two teens sprinted back the way they had come, vanishing into the fog. The man clicked off the flashlight and vanished as well, a specter in the mist.